Welcome back to the How to Podcast series. I'm really glad that you guys could join me again for another episode. I've been jumping into some Facebook groups and trying to help new podcasters. And a lot of questions, a lot of similar questions popping up in these rooms. And there's some great advice being shared by some of the people in the rooms. And I really appreciate that when other podcasters can reach out and help. So I thought I'd try to capture some of my responses. A lot of new podcasters looking to promote their podcast and wondering where is the best location to tell people about their new podcast and their episode launches. So I'm going to jump in that today and talk about that for a little bit here on the How to Podcast series. So you have a new podcast and you're excited to tell the world, where do you go? What's the best way to find a listener for a podcast? So one thing I hear a lot of people talking about is to use social media, build a new platform, build a new Instagram page, build a new Facebook group. Try using a social media platform. It's free to do so. You can build it on TikTok, on Twitter, LinkedIn. There's so many different ways for you to build an audience on social media. Now, just want to keep my thing in mind is an Instagram user may not be a podcast listener. Instagram users are there to use Instagram. Facebook users are there to use Facebook. There's some blending trying to happen between a visual platform, social media platform like Instagram, for example, but the audible side and an hour-long, 40-minute-long, 30-minute-long episode doesn't always translate in a fast-paced social media platform like Instagram, for example. So before you spend all of your time and effort trying to build an audience of potential podcast listeners on a social media platform, consider these as a couple options when you're starting out to build listenership. For me, I prefer to advertise to listeners where the listeners live, and that's in the podcast apps. The listeners are already there looking for the next podcast that they want to commit to and we want to get into and listen to as part of their regular schedule. So they're coming to the podcast app of their choice, whether that be Google or Apple or Spotify or whatever that is. They have their favorite listening apps. So if you want to capture the ears and earbuds of someone on an app, I would suggest you go to where the listeners already are instead of trying to convert a listener to leave Instagram and migrate to a podcast app, especially if they're not podcast listeners. I'm a little nervous when I hear people say that social media is the only place where you can build an audience. There's a lot of other great things you can do too. One thing I've been doing recently with some of podcasters that I've been meeting is offering to do a podcast swap or include a little bumper ad for their podcast on my podcast. So I have a music podcast, the Add to My Playlist podcast, and it's on Spotify. And I've had some other music podcasters liking and commenting and interacting with my social media. So I know they're podcasters, so I've listened to their podcast. And, it's different than what I'm doing. It's a music podcast, but it's not the same style or the same genres or the same musical taste that I might have or my listeners might have. But they're amazing. They're hilarious and they share great stuff and I want to support them. So to share a little bumper, I put one of their bumpers at the end of my podcast just to kind of say, hey, here it is. And actually, I'm going to do it here at the end of this podcast so you can get an example of it as well and give them another free shout out here on this How to Podcast series. So by sharing a commercial for another podcast on your podcast, you're sharing that advertisement with listeners who are already actively on a podcast listening app. Now you've reached the audience that you truly want to go after. And it's probably the best way to gain listenership. So say, hey, find another podcast in your genre. Something don't be nervous. Like You're not going to lose listenership by doing this, but you're going to reach out to somebody who's maybe doing something similar to what you're doing and say, listen, hey, I love your show. I love what you're doing. I would love to kind of give you guys, a commercial bumper at the beginning or the end or somewhere in my podcast, just to give you guys a shout out and say, hey guys, listen to this great podcast that I found and watch what happens. Most likely they're going to ask you to prepare something as well and send that to them so they can put your ad in their podcast. And now combining podcasts like this, it's a great way to advertise your podcast to new listeners who are not on Instagram. They're not on Facebook, but they're podcast listeners. And they get to hear that in their earbuds, put it in your show notes for those that read the show notes, and they can click the link and go straight to the podcast episodes. So think about it. Create specific advertisements. They take like less than a minute, 2 minutes tops. And they're just this little commercial bumper. Throw it up there and see what happens. The other thing is do podcast swaps, where if you have somebody in the same area, a music podcast and a music podcast, how about you guys switch and guest on each other's podcast? You immediately then get to bring in the audience that they listen to, and they get to meet you and you get to meet their audience. It's a really effective way to grow your podcast listenership, especially when you're starting out. If you really want to focus in on social media as a bonus, again, as a bonus, because not all of your listeners are going to be on a visually oriented social media site. If you want to go into doing something on social media, how about doing a live Instagram connection with another podcaster? Bring in their audience, bring in your audience, and combine together, do a live, which Instagram loves, because now there's engagement, there's things happening, and then you will get some listeners from that as well. So don't be afraid of social media. But I'm a little nervous when I see on Facebook or Instagram that most of the answers are geared around building a community on a social media app. You don't own that land, people. That land does not belong to you, and it can be taken away from you at any point. So do your best to fish where the fish are swimming. And they're swimming on a podcast app, just like you are listening to right now. Go where the fish are, and you'll have way more success growing your podcast. Thanks for listening, and check out the next episode coming soon here on the How to Podcast series. I hope you have many, many great experiences as podcasters. This is the most fun you can have with a microphone. Have a good day.